Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. Our plan tonight, we've got about an hour together. We've got some very bright television lights that may interfere with my ability to see you when your time comes, but our plan is that Ahmed and I will talk for about 25 minutes or half an hour or so. I'll ask him some questions, and then at a certain stage I'll ask you to present your own questions. There is that microphone right there in the aisle that you can line up behind, and there may also be someone roving for those of you who are on the edges and such. Just do please identify yourself and keep it brief. There's no doubt that there's going to be many more of you who want to participate than we'll have time for. Thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me to be with you tonight, and congratulations on this book, which, if that's a camera, I'm going to point it at it. This is really the third, as you say, you use the word trilogy, and I think I recognize a kind of self-consciousness in the work that you've been doing between hardcovers about this essential subject, from the Taliban to Descent into Chaos, the great and authoritative book that you produced after the September 11th attacks, and now this as a kind of bookend. And as you say in the introduction, this is a little more meditative and a little more forward-looking and a little more focused on the issues that bedevil Pakistanis, Afghans, and Americans in common. And so I think that's a terrific basis for our conversation. I first went out to the region in 1989 as a green correspondent for the Washington Post, and every time I came through Lahore, Ahmed's house was a place to be educated, and that's still the case all these years later. So I feel like we're having the same conversation we had all that time ago. And of course, the first question everyone arrives in Lahore to ask you is, what is the nature of the crisis in Pakistan this month, Ahmed? And you know, Pakistan is on the brink, but it's always on the brink of something. And I wonder, you know, there is a kind of an accumulation, as you point out in some of these essays, about the failures of the military to come to terms with the true nature of Pakistan's national security, the failures of education, the rise of radicalism. But thinking in the long arc that you've been writing, how serious, what is the nature of the crisis today? How is it different from other periods of crisis that you've chronicled and lived through?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you very much for coming, and thank all of you for coming. And I thank Columbia University for inviting me to be here for this semester. Very, very kind. Everyone connected with the School of Journalism. I think the essential problem, Steve, is that we never grew up after the Cold War ended. You know, the Pakistani elite, which is the military and the civilian elite, never realized that the end of the Cold War meant that you could no longer basically, and certainly 9/11 only reinforced that you could no longer keep extreme Islamic extremists as a front line against India or to use in Afghanistan. That you could not have a foreign policy that was based solely on trying to develop scare tactics, you know, in the region. That, you know, you needed trade and economic advancement and, you know, all the rest of it. And for that, you needed the neighboring countries to be part of a solution. And lastly, you needed to break the dependence that you had on the United States during the Cold War, and you needed to develop your own economy and society and all the rest of it. And essentially, I think the struggle, you know, after 1989 for the last 20 years has been trying to alert the Pakistani elite that, look, the essentials of foreign policy that you have pursued since 1947 no longer work. And I think that is the essence of a crisis. I mean, most countries have a foreign policy that reflects domestic politics and domestic developments and all the rest of it. We have a country where where foreign policy sets the tone of domestic development. So, for example, we have nuclear weapons, but we have no education, or we have no health care. We can't take care of our own public. The last line in the book, I say, you know, the essential factor is that the Pakistani elite has not fulfilled its essential task, which was to take care of the Pakistani people. And that's where, you know, crisis after crisis comes.
So, but how healthy or unhealthy today is civilian politics and civil society-led pressure in Pakistan? How are we on the outside to understand where the PPP government stands. We may have an election later this year or next year where that would mark the first peaceful handoff of an elected civilian government to another. The lawyers' movement, the court, civil society activism in at least some of the urban areas seems to be rising to some extent, certainly compared to the dark days a couple of days ago. But is there a there? Is there enough of an opposition to the military's influence to make a difference?
Well, there's no doubt that especially the domestic political crisis in the last year has been generated by the Supreme Court and the military going for the government, basically trying to topple the government, without wanting to launch a coup, as is the usual norm for the military in Pakistan. But at the same time, the crisis has been perpetrated also by the civilian government of the People's Party, because it has been so inept, it has been extremely corrupt, it's developed a terrible reputation, and it's done very little, for the people. So you have this double whammy of, a military that really nobody wants, and a military that is perhaps much weaker than it was before, because there's now a much greater public resistance to a coup and to military rule than there perhaps ever was before in Pakistan. And the military is deeply aware of this, I think. But at the same time, you have a very corrupt and inept government, which has not been able to deliver the goods. And I do hope, as you say, that there will be an election. A bad, incompetent, corrupt democracy is still better than military rule, because military rule has led us 4 times into a cul-de-sac, where we have to reinvent the wheel and reinvent the wheel of democracy every decade. Military rule lasts for 10 years, and then suddenly, it collapses because of some reason or the other, and we have to reinvent democracy again. So I hope that this election, this government will probably lose the election. There will be another complicated coalition government. I hope that this will be then sustainable, and hopefully the next government and the government after that, as long as there's no military intervention, will be better. And I think the rise of civil society has been very important. But civil society is also very divided. There's a very determined right-wing extremist civil society that is Islamist, anti-Western, anti-democracy, and there's also there's a liberal civil society which wants democracy and good governance, and for the military to go back to the barracks and all the rest of it. So civil society is also very polarized right now in Pakistan.
I know we want to jump and talk about Afghanistan, but you mentioned that the military does not seem to be in a position to be able to intervene now. It's certainly not one of those moments of kind of rescue narrative where the body politic is wishing for military intervention. To the contrary, if they did intervene, they'd probably face stiff resistance. Why?
Well, I think the Musharraf era, people are seeing, the record of the Musharraf era, the getting bogged down in Afghanistan, hosting the Taliban, allowing the growth and the birth and growth of the Pakistani Taliban, the failure to really invest in Pakistan's economy, even though we were getting, $2 to $3 billion a year from the Americans. We got a huge debt write-offs after 9/11, etc. There was just no investment in the country and in the people. Education level is, after 10 years of Musharraf's rule, was the same. So I think that's part of it. But also, I think if you look at it, every coup in Pakistan has been welcomed by and large by the majority of the population. The army knows perfectly well that this time around, half the population would be completely against any kind of military rule. And perhaps there would only be a very small fringe of right-wing religious parties and right-wing sort of, nutters, basically, who would back a military coup. And of course, a military coup would be disastrous. I mean, the 21st century, a country of 180 million people should not be having military coups. They should be allowing democracy to progress. But the essential factor is still that foreign policy is in the hands of the military. And unless the military learns and desires a change where it makes friends with neighboring states, it builds up trade and the economy, etc., and concentrates on Pakistan's own internal situation, rather than having these adventures in Afghanistan, adventures in Kashmir, then we're not